Hello and welcome again back, everyone, to another edition of the Refs Roundtable here on Wrestling with the Future. Like last week, I'm joined by my friends Jason and Mike. Jason, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Mike, thanks for being back.
Likewise, thanks for having me back again.
And today we're taking an interesting look at the successful Vice show, the successful Vice show Dark Side of the Ring. I don't know if you guys know or not, but the recent episode, the series finale, season finale of episode 2, the Owen Hart death, was the top-rated broadcast in Vice TV's history. Wow. So going into that, they have given a third season, and that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to kind of do a roundtable discussion, pitch in some potential ideas. There's a lot in wrestling history still to cover, so we're going to go from there. Those joining us, I'm Dan the Man, and let's get to it. So I'm going to start, and the topic that I want to look at first, one that's interested me because they were my favorites as a kid, a potential topic to look at is the rise, for lack of a better term, and I hate sounding cliche, but the rise and fall of the British Bulldogs. Mm-hmm. They were one of the best, most over tag teams of their generation. And obviously, in the case of Dynamite Kid, injury and substance abuse kind of shortened his career. And you know the story with the British Bulldog and his battles with substance abuse. Mm-hmm. And so, you have a very dark narrative of what could have been greatness that was derailed by just the road and the lifestyle. And, of course, obviously both Dynamite Kid and Davey Boy Smith died way too young mm-hmm. for the talent they were. The famous, Wembley, the SummerSlam, Davey Boy beating Bret Hart for the Intercontinental title. Bret mm-hmm. has told the story before that British Bulldog was coked out of his mind, or on crack, I believe it was. Oh, and man. Bret had to carry him. If you go back and rewatch the match, Bret's a professional, but it's obvious that he's kind of directing everything. But I'm curious, you guys, we'll kind of pitch an idea and bounce around. Jason, first to you. Do you think that there's enough substance there, or that the Bulldogs are enough of a name to carry an episode?
Oh, yeah. First off, they had the best mascot, Matilda.
Of course.
Yeah, they like you said, they were one of the top tag teams back in the day, and both incredible athletes. And like you said, unfortunately, they kind of did cross over to the dark side in their personal lives, so that did hamper their career and their life. But yeah, I've seen stories of Dynamite Kid having a crazy attitude. He was always getting on fights, and there was rumors of him being basically a bully mm-hmm. Back in the locker rooms.
I believe it was the Rougeaus that they had a famous backstage series of, for lack of a better word, a prank war that went a hair too far. Mike, what about you? What are your thoughts on the potential episode of the Bulldogs?
Oh, I think there's definitely a lot of potential there, especially since some of the other names that they've already covered on the show haven't been named that really catch the eye of your average Joe or Jane viewer, but people who know wrestling know that, oh yeah, that's a story to be told there, and this is definitely one of those stories that needs to be told for everybody, I think.
That's a fair point. Well, I'll tell you what, Mike, since I went to Jason with that first question, we'll go to you. What's a topic you would suggest for the next show?
All right. I don't believe they've covered it yet. I was trying to look over the episodes, see what they've covered. I've only seen a handful of episodes so far, but one I think would be really interesting would be China. With her recent inclusion in the WWE video game, kind of bringing her back into the fold posthumously. That's a really interesting one to cover, especially with the rise of women's wrestling as it is right now. She was one of the.
Yeah, that would be one. That would be one you kind of have to walk the line with, because obviously the story of her relationship with Triple H and Stephanie, mm-hmm. and then the Triple H on was it Stone Cold's podcast, where he straight up said that she'll never come back because if you Google her name, the first thing that pops up is adult entertainment. And she had a rough life. And I don't know if you guys know the documentary that they were making about her when she passed. It was actually the film crew that found her. They showed up at her house and were ready to go in the morning. And when nobody answered, they were rolling when the guy went in and she was on the floor. And actually, her mother, I believe it was her sister, it was a female relative, made a big deal about the trailer for the documentary featured not the footage of her, obviously, but of the narrator and the producer walking in her house yelling, Joni, you here? And it was them terrible. Finding the body. I thought that was in poor taste. Jason, what do you think? China, would that be something you could make?
Yes. Oh, wow. Such a tragic story. A great person in the ring and out of the ring. Just from her beginnings, started out where she actually changed her physical features to stand or become more of what the WWE or F at the time wanted.
And a lot of people don't remember when she was off TV for a good chunk of several months, and she had all that work done because she had the real square jaw and she had all the facial reconstruction, kind of get the more feminine features, but still be the badass.
Yeah, I mean, and then she was one of the first, if not the first, female wrestler to capture a men's title, the Intercontinental title for Jeff Jarrett. So there, she, in my personal opinion, should be in by herself in the Hall of Fame. She's already in there as part of DX, and quite honestly, I was surprised that they did that. But I think that was a little bit more of a fan service to the fans because of the discussion. But yeah, she never really got over her personal relationship with Hunter.
Yeah, that's true. I think too, Mike, something to bounce off of. One of the big stories that came out of the Owen Hart episode was the fans really kind of understood where Owen's widow was coming from for her hatred of the company and why she wasn't going to let him be in the Hall of Fame. I think you could tell the story that would really paint the WWF or WWE in a bad light because they did her wrong.
They really did.
The company, and they did very little to help her afterwards until the publicity got to them. And I think that you'd be much like with the Jimmy Snuka episode or the issues with what was it? Obviously Owen Hart, where Vince McMahon has come off looking like a monster on a couple of these episodes.
Right.
That I think that'd be interesting. Yeah. No. I'm gonna go start another one, and then Jason will get to you. One of the ones I would love to see, and it's not as big a history as it should be. I think with the importance was an event that happened in wrestling called Black Saturday. For fans that don't know the story of Black Saturday, Vince McMahon, after making some handshake gentleman agreements and kind of BSing about what the WWF was trying to do, he bought and muscled his way into Georgia Championship Wrestling's time slot on the Turner Network. And this was in 1984. And one day, Black Saturday, because Georgia Championship Wrestling had a huge television audience, they turned on their show, and there was Vince McMahon. I own this time slot now. We're not going to see your crap Southern wrestling. We're going to show you the WWF, which is the new power. And that led to there was a famous altercation between Ole Anderson and Vince McMahon at an NWA event. And then obviously Ted Turner, that was part of the reason that he did what he did with getting Vince McMahon later was when he was still coming, I shouldn't say coming up through the business. It was his network. But when he was building the Turner Empire, Vince McMahon screwed him because that time slot was a huge money draw, and it lost ratings quickly because your Southern Georgia wrestling fans don't care about what was the WWF at the time. If you guys remember, I think we're all old enough to remember that 80s, late 80s, even early 90s, the difference between your NWA and WCW and WWF, you still had that Southern wrestling was different. You wouldn't see some of the stuff you were seeing in the WWF on a Crockett or a Georgia Championship Wrestling show. Just like you wouldn't get a Dusty Rhodes Ric Flair bloody cage match, damn near fighting to the death on a Saturday night WWF program.
Oh man.
Yeah.
So, go ahead, Jason.
On a personal, when I grew up watching wrestling, I always watched WWF. When I went over to my grandparents' house, it was my grandfather watching WCW or Crockett.
Yeah.
That was the only time that I watched the other federation. So it was neat seeing the two different styles.
See, I actually kind of lucked out getting them both, because when I was a kid, at the time I lived in Maryland, and the local, the Annapolis, Maryland channel was the WWF, but the local news channel, which was channel 10, I still remember that, was Baltimore, and Baltimore was an NWA territory. So the Saturday morning show was what was early WCW, Crockett, NWA in the late 80s into the early 90s. And then the other channel was WWF. So I got to see, Hulk Hogan growing up. And then you watch Saturday morning, you change the channel, and there's Ricky Steamboat and Ric Flair. So I got both of them because I lived right in that median where both local channels were in two different territories. Something a lot of fans miss out on was the territory days.
Yeah, so, definitely.
That
Mike,
reminds me of
what's that?
That reminds me of a quick story I have. When I went to a SmackDown taping in 2002, it was the first time that Ric Flair had been back in Norfolk since the WCW days.
Oh,
the
nice.
Crowd pop when he came was tremendous. There was nothing else I've ever seen like that experience live. That was.
To sidetrack a little bit, because it's my show and I can do that, I'll tell you guys another funny story. In the NWA and territory days, one of the big names, one of the biggest what if stories in wrestling history was Magnum TA.
Yes.
Magnum TA is from this area, and he went to the Norfolk schools here, and he was at the first Norfolk wrestling team that they had, and he was a guest on our show, I guess, a few weeks back. And in researching, I got in touch with the old school and actually ended up getting him added to their famous alumni page because he wasn't on it.
Awesome.
Oh, nice.
So, and apparently it's on their Wikipedia page now, so it's super internet official. But you talk about that. No, Jason, we'll bounce back to you. Mike brought up China. What would you suggest if you were to have a show?
Well, I'm wearing the shirt. I would say the Ultimate Warrior. Besides, my personal favorite growing up, I think he's very similar to China's life. He kind of like a fallen angel type. He came in. He was, he actually started out with Sting. That's how he was found. They were back in the early days of tag team, but he was being prepped to be the next Hogan. And I think he let it get to his head, or that's what people say. And he had a very famous clashes with Vince over various issues. And, he was released. He came back, released again. And for years, he was in constant lawsuits. I mean, to the point where he even changed his name legally to Warrior.
Yes.
And the nice thing and the sad thing is at the end he was able to reconcile with Vince, with Hogan at the Hall of Fame, and then the next day, and he had that awesome promo on Raw the next day. Yeah. And then I think it was the next day after that, or the day after. He passed away
to the parking lot in the hotel Tuesday morning.
Yeah.
And
so it I want to say it's like he knew just the coincidence of it, how it played out, but it almost seems like he was able to reconcile some of his demons and get some of that stress and stuff off of him before he ultimately passed away.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, you could not have scripted. I mean, the heart, how he talked about you're going to live forever in your fans.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
you could not have scripted a better promo for that being the last time someone appeared on camera.
Seriously.
Mike, I'm gonna bounce to you on this one. The WWE did the Rise and Fall of the Ultimate Warrior DVD set,
Yeah.
which
I
was
remember that.
very inclusive, but also very one-sided.
Yeah.
In that it made Warrior look very bad. They talked about Eric Bischoff, where he talked about how much money Warrior wanted to be in WCW, which is apparently a story that's been disputed. I'm curious, how do you think that a Warrior-centered episode would be different from all the material between the documentaries and the YouTube videos and everything that's already been covered of his life?
I mean, that's definitely one of those stories that you would have to definitely look back and try to find a different angle on it that hasn't been told before, much like how they did the Montreal Screwjob episode. Like, they found some different, unique perspectives that, even though we've heard the story a billion times, we haven't heard this angle over here, this way to look at it.
That's a good point. Okay. No, I like it. I mean, the Warrior, China, two very similar, very dark stories. I'm actually going to touch on a maybe not a similar story because mine is still alive, but one of the people I think would make a great narrative for Dark Side of the Ring is doing an episode on Marty Jannetty. And
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Marty Jannetty, obviously, he's often regarded as the second fiddle, and even to the point where in the current day, the current product for the last 20, 25 years, when a tag team star breaks out, the other tag team member is known as the Jannetty. Like, who's going to be the Jannetty of this tag team? And it's funny, if you look at it, that Marty Jannetty was just as talented and over as Shawn Michaels.
Mm-hmm.
He had obviously his personal demons with the drugs and the alcohol and the partying. And then he was also the victim of a lot of backstage politics. Shawn Michaels, it will be the first to tell the story of how badly he screwed him. And Vince kind of cheated him, and Marty sort of fell off the wagon a little bit. And it's the narrative very similar to what you had with China, where you had somebody who got wronged and had the bad lifestyle and kind of came back and left and came back, and the occasional cameo where the Rockers do a reunion on Raw or something, or if you remember, Marty Jannetty was involved in the Master Lock Challenge during one of those feuds. And he had the match with Kurt Angle, which I thought was amazing, which led to without that match, you never would have had the sexy Kurt promo, which was still great. But I think Jannetty's a good story to go to. Mike, I'm going to go to you with this one. Where do you think they could go with that, being that you'd have to balance telling the story of Marty Jannetty with also framing the narrative away from what so many people already know, that he was a what if or a washout or something?
I mean, I think with that one, you would have to bring in some of the politics that kept him from getting there. You'll have to bring in you have to basically tell a story of Shawn Michaels a little bit as well. It'd be like almost like a story on the Rocker instead of just Marty Jannetty, and it would be how one rose, one fell. One of those kind of things.
No, that's a fair point. Jason, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, one thing that I've really enjoyed about this series is the way they go about the topic. So, for example, Benoit's episode, they brought in his son, his aunt that haven't spoken in years. So if they were to bring in other people that had another viewpoint, another aspect to Marty's or the Warrior or China's stories, I think he could be really done well and bring some new information to their stories.
I like it. Mike, back to you. What would you suggest for a potential episode?
All right. Well, we've already covered one favorite. I've got to talk about my other one, CM Punk. He would make a fantastic episode just because he went from the mid card to basically almost the face of the company for a little bit there, and then at the height of his fame, he just walks away. Just walks.
A lot of people don't realize that the CM Punk was one of the gangsters hanging off the side of the car during John Cena's WrestleMania entrance.
Oh.
Just like DDP drove the drove the honky tonk man's Cadillac. But I mean, you're right. There's a guy that went from virtual obscurity who was basically, I don't want to say buried, but they didn't realize what they had, and he got himself over pre-social media era. We talked about it in the last episode. People like your Zack Ryders who have been able to get to. So CM Punk was able to do that just on his presence and talent. So, Mike, let you expand on that. Where would you go with that narrative? Like Jason talked about with how they have a different story. Would you touch on the entire career, or would you focus on maybe the last 2 years where he went from champion to the story where they forced him to go to Europe even though they knew he was sick, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think I would definitely more focus on the latter part, because the first part, a lot of people know that story. He had his fantastic documentary DVD, which I still rewatch every now and again to this day. So people know that part, the up until the pipe bomb and all that famous stuff. But that second half, the Brock Lesnar feud and that whole thing. So
you would start the story at the pipe bomb and go from there.
The pipe bomb, yeah.
Okay, that's a good one. Jason, do you have anything to expand on that?
I'm not too familiar with him. I do know his one of his last interviews where he sat down on the ramp at Raw and just shot over the company. I do remember hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was basically independent that was just picked up for a developmental, and he kind of grew from there. He kind of reminds me of what we were talking about last week when I brought up Darby Allin from AEW. He had this following already that WWE did not know what to do with. He had fans in the crowds and all, just cheering for him.
You're absolutely right. That goes to what I was saying. CM Punk was really, at least in my mind, I mean, obviously you had people like maybe Christopher Daniels, or early AJ Styles, but I think CM Punk was the first indie darling of the modern era.
Oh yeah, definitely.
You had some names when towards the end of the fall of WCW in the early 2001 when some of the indie names started coming up, but really mid 2000s when the idea of an indie darling first started, as Punk was the big one. Interestingly, I don't know if you guys caught that or not. He had a lawsuit against WWE against their medical staff involving the missed staff diagnosis that he could have easily died, and he went over some issues there, how they kind of forced him into some things. During that lawsuit, apparently the narrative, they had to explain the right naming rights and owning rights, and the CM in CM Punk stands for Chick Magnet. That was official, like per his testimony in court. So there's a bit for you. I think CM Punk's a good one, especially the fact that with his legit straight edge lifestyle, you wouldn't really you could gloss, or not even gloss over. There wouldn't be any dark skeletons in the closet, drug story, or alcohol stories like some of these episodes have talked about. To touch on, you could stay entirely on the narrative. I like that. Yeah. That's a good one.
Now, would you stay just with the wrestling, or would you venture into his UFC experiments?
I think, and Mike, I'll let you answer this too, but I think you could touch on both of them, because his UFC career, very short-lived UFC career, he's maybe not back, but he's made a few appearances on the Talking Smack show.
Yeah.
So I think that's a waste of a return on a show about a show that no one watches. But
yes, but his when he first came back, that was one of the most talked about situation. I mean, I watched it several times just to repeat just what he said. I mean, his shoot style, his even though I wasn't a big fan or knew him very well, but the way he talks, I mean, he is a great talker.
Well, I don't know what it is now. Obviously, there's been a lot of additions to social media with this empty arena era, but there was at the time it was reported that his comeback, that was that 10-minute clip of him walking out and basically they asked him about Raw and he said he doesn't watch the product because it sucks. That that was one of the most watched YouTube videos in WWE's library, and it was only a few weeks old.
Wow.
So, Mike, to let you answer that question, you agree you would touch on his UFC career as well as his return?
Oh, definitely, because I mean that just shows that with WWE they always say never say never, and that was just one of those times that you proved it.
I mean that's a good one because you've got obviously CM Punk, who was in a legit lawsuit at the time. You've got the Warrior, who had threatened to kill Vince McMahon at some point. Even Jeff Jarrett, who Vince McMahon came out on television and said, this piece of crap is never going to work for me again. And now he's one of the most respected backstage producers, and he was at the Rumble and somehow managed to have a mini feud that turned Elias face. So good for him. So, all right, we've got CM Punk. That's a good one. Jason, what would be your next suggestion for an episode?
Let me take a look at my list. So, another one of my favorite characters or wrestlers, Jake the Snake.
Oh yeah,
he's another classic story in the vein of Warrior in China. Hit rock bottom, pardon the pun, and he's actually has come back with the help of DDP through his DDP yoga to straighten out his life. But if anybody's seen the Beyond the Mat documentary, he was just in rough shape. I heard the next film, The Resurrection of Jake the Snake, was really good. I haven't had a chance to see that.
It was very good.
But yeah, he's another person that he could have gone very far with WWE or WWF at the time, and if he just had everything in check. I mean, one of his dreams before he actually left, he wanted to be a writer full time with them, and he did do some writing, but that's what he wanted to do full time. And just if he had that chance, I think the whole landscape of WWF would have been different.
Oh, that's a good one. One of the stories that pops up from time to time was they had built a feud between we're teasing a feud between Jake Roberts and Hulk Hogan. And at the first interaction they had, the crowd started chanting DDT, DDT, and there was a concern that because Jake was so over, even as I mean, just a vile, interrupting weddings and attacking women, and the bloody snake on Macho Man. I mean, vile monster of a villain.
Crap out of me as a kid.
but he was people still loved him. I mean, he scared the crap out of me as a kid. He was still one of my favorites because he was just so awesome with that. You could really touch on that, and anybody, you have a great resurrection story there too, because anybody that watches AEW, I mean, even at his advanced age, he's still one of the best promos in the business by far, and it's obvious that he's not reading cliff notes off his arm. It's not scripted. So, what do you think, Mike? You think how would you approach a Jake Roberts episode?
Oh man, where to begin? I think you would have to put in. That's one of those stories I think you would have to tell everything, because people know the name, and they might know part of his story. They might know the Resurrection documentary. They might know how he looked in the Beyond the Mat documentary, and you really would need to tell the entire story.
Yeah, I think it would be like you had mentioned earlier with the looking at it from a different perspective, because you have the Beyond the Mat touched on it, and the Resurrection of the Snake. You could approach some of a story that's already been told from perhaps a perspective that hasn't been seen yet. So I mean, that's a lot of interesting points, and I mean we have a lot more to cover as we approach the halfway point. Though, you guys, special treat. This is the first refs roundtable that with our official sponsors. So I want to do a quick shout out to our friends, Wrestling with the Future friends at Manscaped. Manscaped is a new friend of the program, official sponsor. And I mean, I knew as a kid, it's a child of the 80s. So I knew growing up, Wolfman's got nards. So if Wolfman wants to take care of that, Manscaped's built for you. I mean, really, if you think about it, life's been nuts with this recent Corona stuff, and to be honest, it's even been hard to get out of the sack. But now we've all head back to the field of life, and with our friends at Manscaped Personal Grooming Supplies, you could definitely say that life is going to be a whole new ball game. So for our friends out there, go ahead to manscaped.com enter the promo code WrestlingFuture for a 20% discount off your purchase. And for those interested, they have a lot of package deals as well as starter kit. And with your Wrestling Future promo code, you have an even greater deal there. Check them out, our friends at manscaped.com, for all your manscaping needs. So back to our point here, gentlemen, I want to touch on another issue, another potential episode, and that's something that I'm surprised they haven't dealt with yet, and that's the WWF steroid scandal.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah.
And you have the steroid trial itself. You have the narrative being that Vince McMahon, had he not have won that case, that was serious jail time. You're looking, they say minimum 10 to 15 years. And obviously that didn't come about. But the problem was the Vince McMahon, he was kind of tarnished. Even to this day, his legacy, yes, the Mr. McMahon character, and he still has some of the appeal, but there's his legacy is forever tarnished by that. And the two things obviously you could touch on, I think would really be the focus, was your key witness was Hulk Hogan. And Hulk Hogan, straight up in so many words of his testimony, he admitted that, obviously, look at me, look at Ultimate Warrior, look at Rick Martel, Randy Savage, look at these guys. Vince McMahon knows there's juice in that locker room, but nobody will tell you they got their steroids from Vince McMahon. Vince McMahon was a smart businessman. If you don't look like a Greek statue with huge muscles, you're not getting pushed in this company. I'm not telling you to go take steroids. I'm not going to give them to you, but there's only one way to get that physique, especially some of the older performers at the time. You don't put on 40 pounds of muscle when you're 53 without help. Let's be honest.
Right.
And the second story coming out of that was the wrestler Nails, the inmate Big Boss Man villain. He was a witness in the trial, and he fell apart on the stands and got painted as this angry ex-employee that would say whatever he needed to say to punish Vince McMahon.
I wonder what happened to him.
Not much after that. So no. Jason, I'll bounce to you. The steroid trial. What aspects of that would you want to focus on if they were to look at that for a future episode?
That's right. I guess that's one of them on my list. You basically said it. I would do, leading up to it. I would probably try to get, if they could, some of the former prosecution with the state or the federal government.
Actually get some of the attorneys involved.
Yeah. I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard it told by him. But Jerry Jarrett said that he was brought in case Vince was convicted, and he was going to run WWF through Vince. I mean, getting
the cartel drug lord still running this in prison.
Yeah. So, maybe have him, if they could track down the guy that played Nails, get his side.
Oh, man.
But yeah, I mean, it's not rocket science to see that these guys had some help with their physiques, and then just the nature of their of wrestling, the amount of damage and stuff that they go through with their bodies and all, and was it 364 days or whatever that they're constantly doing this, that they've had to have had or have used stuff. I mean, for them to say, I remember seeing a clip of Hogan on the Arsenio Hall show denying that he ever took anything, and then he turned around and saying they did.
It's interesting that his appearance on the Arsenio Hall show was actually used in the trial because when you're in something like an interview or a talk show, Hulk Hogan was an official representative of the World Wrestling Federation.
Yeah.
So what he said is an official statement from the company. When he says, I've never used it, no one's ever used it, that is WWF's officially saying we are acknowledging no one on our roster. And of course, anybody with a set of eyes can look at somebody and go,
Right.
seriously?
Right.
Take your prayers,
I
take your
remember
steroids.
I remember Jesse Ventura saying once that when he would hear Hulk Hogan cut his promo about taking the vitamins, and he would say, yeah, somebody in the back would always yell at the monitor, like, swallow or injectable? Like, so, Mike, I'll let you expand on that. The steroid trial, what would you do with that episode?
That one, I really like the idea that you guys have brought forth so far, bringing the attorneys in the case. And I would definitely bring in any of the older big guys, because that was definitely how it was back in those days. I remember as a kid, it was WWE, that was the big muscly guys, and that was all wrestling was back in the 80s especially.
Yeah.
You can't have that without the steroids.
and I mean, even before I understood what steroids were, I remember watching somebody like Randy Savage when he was injured and came back, or Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 9, where you're looking at him and you're like, why is he so small? Like, it's noticeable that he was a different size, and you don't think about, oh, well, that's what happens. And now even in today's wrestling, where apparently they're supposed to have wellness policies and steroid tests, and let's be honest, we know that's kind of bunk, especially when you hear stories about someone like Randy Orton, where CNN reports that he failed another one and nothing happens.
Right.
Or if you guys remember in the case of Brock Lesnar, he fought in the UFC, got suspended for popping positive, and the WWE came out, a day or two later, and said that because they're not an official sports league, they're not governed by the rules of the athletic association, so they don't have to punish Brock Lesnar. And because he was a guest employee or a temporary employee, he wasn't covered by the wellness policy, because they straight up were like, the drug he popped for is on your wellness list, and he was going to be at SummerSlam, and they're like, oh, well, that doesn't count, temporary employee. I mean, they knew, they don't.
Well, yeah, I mean, I brought him up earlier. Warrior, when Warrior came back, he was very noticeably different, and then that started up a rumor that there was two Warriors.
Yeah, because he was a different size and his hair color was different. Yeah, it was noticeably two different people. That goes to the new Paul McCartney theory. So that's something that kind of never go away. Jason got in the last one. Mike, what would you be your next suggestion for an episode?
One that I'm not too familiar with, but I'm only familiar with like the legend of everything. And Brian Pillman would make a fantastic episode.
Yes. Another one on my list.
Brian Pillman Jr., his son is a friend of the show. He's been on the show a few times. And you guys in the local area, Brian Pillman Jr. has wrestled for VCW here in Virginia a couple of times.
Awesome. I think I've been one of the shows.
Yeah, he's really coming along. But no, Brian Pillman is, I mean, that's very similar to, because they've touched on a couple of these episodes with the woulda, coulda, shoulda, and I mean, Brian Pillman's a great example of a what if. I mean, between keeping himself clean and his very untimely injuries, Brian Pillman's a great one. Jason, what are your thoughts on a Brian Pillman episode?
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, I have that on my list as well. I vaguely remember seeing him in the early days of Raw coming in. What I do remember of him, he had already sustained a leg injury, so he had the cast, and he was put with the new Heart Foundation when they were doing the Bash in the U.S. at the time. Great character, ahead of his time. I kind of think personally that that was the genesis of Stone Cold. I think Steve Austin kind of took some pointers from Brian's character.
Well, because they were a team too.
Yeah.
They come up together, and obviously the incident with Brian Pillman and the gun.
Oh yeah,
and that was, I mean, that's one of the most infamous, in a very negative way, infamous moments in wrestling history, where you basically implied before your show ended, Brian Pillman just murdered somebody.
Yeah. that almost cost WWF their spot with USA.
Yeah,
because of that. That was a big thing.
I mean, even in the Attitude Era, USA Network was they gave leeway, but open use of firearms was not one of them. Very similar to Sky TV in England gave the WWF, or at the time WWF, serious leeway, and there was a pay-per-view. I'm trying to remember which one it was now, but during the pay-per-view, the Cat, if you guys remember her, the diva, Jerry Lawler's wife at the time, or girlfriend, she flashed the camera and exposed herself intentionally as part of, it wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't part of the script. She just kind of went into business for herself, and Sky TV dropped them for I don't know if they still have it, but they dropped them as part of that was a violation of a lot of their regulations. I think that's interesting to see. Brian Pillman, you could go in really two different directions. You could look at the sad tragedy of his death, as well as obviously some of the stories, because like Mike touched on. I mean, you nailed it right on the head, Mike. That more myth than fact at this point when you have that kind of name. And we talked to him. I mentioned Brian Pillman Jr. being on the show. We talked to him about that, with that that's a shadow that his name is going to forever be synonymous with, no matter what he does in his career. And he is an amazing talent. He actually mentioned, I asked him about if he would be willing to do a Bray Wyatt kind of narrative where they never acknowledge that Bray Wyatt's a rotunda. They never acknowledge that Bo Dallas is a rotunda, versus say a Ted DiBiase Jr., where his entire character was, I'm Ted DiBiase's kid. And he said he would do it in a heartbeat if he thought that that he could make it, or if he thought that it would work. He would drop the name and never mention that he was a Pillman again. But he looks a lot like his father, so I don't know if that would work.
Yeah.
But no, that's a good one, Brian Pillman. Jason, to you, what would be your next suggestion for a show?
Kind of moving from the one character and get a little more scandalous. The sex scandals in WWF. There was actually some rumors and innuendos about a ring announcer, I believe, Pat Patterson. There's always rumors, but there was several lawsuits through the years against them. Even Vince had a couple of lawsuits against him from a couple women. So maybe not focusing just on, maybe focusing in both. Overall.
I mean, even unfortunately, even in today, with women's wrestling being as dominant and respected as it is, there's still stories that pop up from time to time in today's wrestling.
Paige's sex tape.
What's that?
Paige's sex tape that got
leaked. And Paige wasn't the only one. There was several high-profile wrestlers that had stuff leaked, and that's unfortunate, because you have, I mean, in the modern age, that can, I mean, we've seen it with Paige. She still talks about how it still haunts her to this day, because she with people being as terrible as they are, anytime she makes an appearance or a comment on a YouTube page, she's going to be reminded of it. It's sad. Yep. I think, to go on, Jason, you mentioned the Never Say Never from earlier. One of the lawsuits against the WWF for sexual harassment was from Sable. And after that lawsuit was resolved, she still came back to the company and did her little run with Tori and her second bit with the company. But I think, I like that. Mike, what do you think about doing maybe an episode, instead of focusing on one or two cases, kind of an overall shady underside of wrestling? Because as Jason mentioned, it doesn't have to necessarily be women. I know Pat Patterson has had allegations from male wrestlers of some of against him, and so kind of a shady underbelly episode.
Yeah, that would be a great topic, because then you could do things that don't necessarily merit a whole episode, like the Edge Matt Hardy Leadus. Real life sex.
That's a good one. Yeah, I didn't think about that.
On my list.
You can bring that one right into the banner easily.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. Well, we get to the end. You guys, you both mentioned you have lists, so we're gonna each do one more, and I'm gonna do the one I intentionally saved for last, because I'm I'm picturing my personal hero in wrestling is Jim Cornette, and I'm picturing what he would have to say about this topic. And the episode I would love to see is a Dark Side of the Ring episode on Vince Russo in WCW.
Oh,
and
yes.
I mean, you have four. I wrote down 4 major talking points, and that's the first is within 6 months of him being head writer / booker, WCW's pay-per-view revenue was cut in half.
Yep.
He publicly clashed with Hulk Hogan and Bret Hart and Goldberg and several stars. Obviously, the infamous pay-per-view pipe bomb where he came out and completely just trashed Hulk Hogan and talked about, this is crap and he's fired and all this shit. And Hulk Hogan even mentioned, like, this is why the company's in the state it's in, and never came back. And it kind of blurred the lines, which is the third point. The narrative of Vince Russo, the big defining WCW in 99, 2000 was that kayfabe wasn't real. It was dead, and not dead in the sense of Vince McMahon saying that we're not a real sport. But I mean, Vince Russo wanted the audience to be in on the joke. They would have entire storylines where I remember a pay-per-view match where Goldberg in the middle of the match just rolls out of the ring and walks away. And the announcers are like, wait, that's not in the script. Goldberg's supposed to win. Like, what is he doing? He's breaking the script. And obviously that's part of the story.
Yeah.
But the story became what's a story. And you had so many convoluted plot lines involving this is scripted. Goldberg was supposed to say this, and this was supposed to happen with Hulk Hogan, but he went into business for himself, and that's why I'm on TV now. And obviously, what's that?
Just want to say 4 words about that whole era. David Arquette, WCW champion.
That was my next point. Was some of the defining moments. Not just David Arquette. Remember Vince Russo was WCW champion
as well.
And you had moments like there was. Apparently, the network blocked it. There was talk of making Tank Abbott WCW champion with his infamous 30-second matches. And that obviously the Goldberg heel turn that just completely destroyed everything. And the New Blood storyline which that's a great example of the booking. Remember the storyline, the big story between the New Blood, which was all the young talent, your Vampiro and those guys. And then the Millionaires Club, Sting, Ric Flair, and the Millionaires. The story was these Millionaires Club, they were the old timers who refused to give the spotlight to the young guys, and they wouldn't work with Billy Kidman, and they wouldn't work with these young kids. And they were the baby faces. Like, you had a perfect story because let's be honest, when I'm watching a match between Hulk Hogan and Billy Kidman, I don't care how much work Hulk Hogan puts in. At no point do I ever believe Billy Kidman's legitimately going to win this match, regardless.
Yeah.
Lex Luger can do everything he wants to put over Vampiro. Vampiro's not beating Lex Luger. These new stars they brought in just weren't to that caliber. And Vince Russo tried to build the company. And like I said, I would love to hear Jim Cornette's take on it because.
Oh yeah.
And I'm not saying that as a criticism of Vince Russo. I have a lot of respect for what he's done. I've mentioned on the show before, there's definitely things I disagree with him on, but he's obviously Vince Russo is the father of the Attitude Era, and some of the biggest, best moments of that era were entirely him. Some of the worst ones were entirely him too, but I would love to see that narrative because here was a company, 83 weeks consecutive, they beat the WWF, and they were still 10, 15, 20,000 sellouts at Nitro in the middle of, wherever they were having the show from. And you could also touch on, towards the end of his run, obviously they brought Eric Bischoff back and they kind of took some control from him. WCW didn't die because of the ratings. It died because new TNT leadership took over, Turner leadership after Ted Turner stepped down, and they just didn't want to be associated with wrestling. Yep. And then they sold the entire WCW name and catalog to Vince McMahon for pennies. I mean, Eric Bischoff even mentioned that he had built a group together, and Chris Jericho mentioned when he heard the final total, if he had known that that's what he could have paid, he would have bought WCW. But I think that for me personally, I think you could really bridge the gap because the modern product, the stale kind of beaten product that's seen its ratings drop every year since 2000 really began with the failed invasion angle, because at the time at the time WCW was floundering, the WWF was just kind of finishing up the corporate ministry storyline. The It's Me, Austin, you remember that?
Yeah,
and a lot of there was a gap. You had WrestleMania, you had to build up, and then WCW started coming in about 6 months later, and you had what could have been the greatest thing in wrestling. And then, of course, the story, you guys know the story where WCW was creative. And for the listeners out there, I'll touch on something that doesn't often get talked about, is WCW was very creative by having a lot of their high talent, their Hulk Hogan's, your Goldbergs, your Kevin Nash's. They didn't work for WCW. They worked for Turner Broadcasting. Hulk Hogan was getting his multi-million-dollar a year contract from Turner Broadcasting, not from WCW. So when WCW put their books out and said, "Look, we made money this year," no, you didn't. If you count in, you only made money because $40 million in contracts are coming out of Turner's checkbook and not WCW's.
Wow.
So these guys that had these guaranteed Turner contracts, Hogan, Nash, Booker T, some of them, a lot of them, Ric Flair, they told WWF, "We're good. We'll stay home, guaranteed contract. When it's over, then we'll talk."
Yeah.
So when they pushed the invasion angle, they didn't have any big names.
It was the new blood.
yeah. I mean, I think teenage me wants to see WWF versus WCW. I'm thinking Undertaker versus Sting.
Yeah.
I'm not thinking Bradshaw versus Chuck Palumbo. That's not what I'm getting at. So I just think I really personally, I think that's a great bit they could do. So wrapping up there, Mike, what would be your final suggestion for an episode?
My final suggestion kind of goes in line with the sex thing, but I think she could merit her own story altogether. Sunny.
Yeah.
She was the hottest woman of the 90s. And just, that's,
She's still having issues.
Unfortunately, someone who's in recent years proven that she's a terrible human being. Actually, I joked on our last show about bringing her on for as a guest, because I talked about, obviously we do the show through Skype. I mean, you guys know for about the cost of an interview, you could have a hell of a good show with Sunny.
Well, you did tell me not to promote that.
I meant all kidding. That's of course joking. All kidding aside, as long as I'm on the Roundtable, that she's proven she's a terrible human being. She's not welcome on this show. But no, I think Sunny would be a good episode, because you could touch on the build up, and then obviously you could go into the Chris Candido story, and then there's numerous your Sandmans, your Road Warrior Animal that have some less than flattering things to say as far as backstage bits. So, Jason, to you, what would you do with a Sunny episode?
Where do I begin? Well, you kind of mentioned it. I would, she really screwed Chris Candido over. He's another, in a way, like China. She didn't get over Triple H. He was badly in love with Sunny, and she just walked right over him. And there's rumors that, not only, it was famously known that she was with Shawn Michaels and all, but there's rumors that during the Shawn Michaels Bret Hart that she was with Bret Hart. That's the reason why HBK talked about the Sunny days on live TV.
Which legitimately pissed off Bret Hart's wife.
Yeah. I think Shawn lost some hair out of that that mention of that. She's a character.
Yeah, that was actually one of the, I don't want to say one of the first, but she took a beating on I guess what was early social media when her book, she went into very unflattering, probably should keep to yourself details about her relationship with Shawn Michaels. I'm not going to repeat any of them, but she touched on the specific things that he liked and specific things that they did. and it's admitting there's a difference between admitting you had a relationship and being one step above a penthouse letter.
Yeah, right.
And
exactly.
So yeah, that's a good one. I like that, Mike. Sunny would be a very interesting episode. You could also touch on obviously what she's done since. She, I'm ashamed I know this because of research for various other shows, but her internet presence, I don't know now with her recent social media failings where she revealed that apparently racism is a character trait that she shares with people, that her private websites was one of the top trafficked private sites. So I guess wrestling fans are still out there for her. I don't know.
Well,
so go ahead, Jason.
You have to give her some credit. She was the first quote unquote diva.
Yes.
True.
I don't consider Elizabeth a diva.
No, not in the slightest.
She's in a class all her own.
Oh, she was. I mean, and she was a manager as a manager. She was a ring presence, and then even some people will try and pass that title to Sherry Martel. But I think Sherry Martel could go in the ring. She could do a Hurricane Rana.
Definitely.
And she could take bumps. And yes, she was gorgeous and she was amazingly talented. But she wasn't. Sunny was the first real presence on modern wrestling that she was on TV. And I say modern wrestling because let's be honest, there were some eye candy diva, or not divas, but eye candy managers back in the territory days.
Of course.
But she was the first real cable mainstream. I'm here because I'm hot, and that is all I have. I'm not going to cut a good promo. I'm certainly not going to have a good match. But without Sunny, you wouldn't have had your Sables. You wouldn't have had that entire era of the diva, the bra and panty pudding matches, and all that crap.
Right.
So I think that's a good one. I like that. So, Jason, what would be your final suggestion for?
I wore a shirt of him last week. Ric Flair, particularly, we almost lost him in a plane crash. Luckily, he walked away with some back injury. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, it's almost like if he didn't, I mean, where would wrestling be? Because he was fairly young in his run with that. So that if you wanted to expound upon just his life, another issue that another incident was he left WCW with the big gold belt. I mean, he bought it at the time.
Yeah, and, he had the deposit. That was common in the territory days. You paid the promoter a deposit and you got your money when you lost the title back. And they wouldn't give him his money, so he took the belt with him. Oh, there it is. Yeah.
I remember the lead up to him coming over. Bobby the Brain Heenan had the big gold belt.
Yeah.
On WWF TV. The real people's champion.
Yeah.
And for the first couple episodes or so at all, you saw it clearly, and then they started digitizing.
They would blur it out a little bit.
They started blur it out. I wish his first run in WWF was a little more successful. I don't think it was. I don't think they really knew how to utilize them. But that lead up, I think that was one of the.
They had him, and they didn't know what to do with him in the sense that yes, you had. I mean, he was champion. And his feuds with the Macho Man.
Yeah.
He was people forget he was a multi-time champion. And then obviously he ended up losing the loser leaves town match to Mr. Perfect. Mm-hmm. But he had a run, and they didn't know what to do. And one of those big stories
Flair versus Hogan, which could have happened, but that didn't. That would have been
exactly. Right. And the story goes they had a series of house show matches that didn't get the reaction Vince McMahon was hoping for. So they switched it to Flair, Macho Man. But, I mean, you had prime Flair, prime Hogan, the two biggest names in wrestling, and that match didn't happen until Bash at the Beach in WCW.
Yeah.
And Hogan's first WCW title win. Big shock. Hogan shows up and goes over somebody. But and And let's be honest, as much as I love both of them, even as a WCW fan, I got tired of Flair and Hogan only wrestled about 17,000 times in the 6 years they were together.
Exactly.
But no, that's a good one, and I like that. I think we've touched on a lot, and season 3, there's some rumors floating around. Several people, including Hulk Hogan, have implied they've been approached by producers, whether that be an episode for him or needing him for an interview, which I was shocked, as big a name as he is, that he didn't show up in the show yet for anything. What's that?
Especially on the Macho Man episode, the first.
Yeah, I mean he you know, they referenced him obviously in the Macho Man episode, and he worked with Dino Bravo. They talked about him where they canceled the match because Dino Bravo was a bigger star in Canada. I think they could have touched on a lot of things, but yeah, it's very interesting, and I look forward to the 3rd season. Hopefully, with so many shows being pushed back because of what's happening with coronavirus, that it's not going to be an 18-month wait between seasons. You know? And hopefully a successful 3rd season leads to a 4th, because there's so. I mean, we touched on right here. I mean, just between us, we went over about 15 topics.
Right.
And you know, you have a handful of episodes. We just gave them so that my fee's 10%, guys, at Vice. We just gave you two seasons worth of ideas.
There you go.
So, Mike, man, you better get that email ready if we see a Sunny episode. We know they stole a few. So
check the YouTube, check the podcast.
There it is. Yes, everything will be timestamped. But no, we gave them a lot, and it's an interesting topic. It really is, and we could keep going. I mean, we could really touch on a lot more. So I appreciate it. Obviously, you guys are friends of the program. You've been here before. Jason, thank you so much for coming. Mike, thank you so much for coming. Jason, you have any parting words?
Just that I can't wait for the 3rd season. I think this is an excellent produced show. Mm-hmm. I hope they keep Jericho as the narrator. I think he's very great in that role. I'm just looking for the next season. Can't wait.
I take nothing away from Dutch Mantel. He's always been one of my favorites, but Jericho, I think, has the better voice for those stories.
Yeah,
he does.
So, Mike, you have any parting words? I know you got some stuff to talk about on your way out.
I'd like to promote. I write for a horror blog. It's called horrorbound.com. I'm the senior correspondent over there. You can find me talk about horror movies and horror and pop culture, and the whole writing staff over there is great people. If you like horror, definitely check them out. And you can find me on Twitter at real_geek, GEEK, and check me out over there. And I'll talk wrestling. I talk whatever pops off the top of my mind.
That's awesome. What was that website one more time?
Horrorbound.com.
Horrorbound.com. New friends of the program. So Jason, Mike, thank you guys. For Jason, for Mike, I'm Dan the Man. For Wrestling with the Future, we can be found on Twitter at Wrestling Future. That's no G, Wrestling Future. We're on Facebook, Wrestling with the Future Podcast. I myself am on Twitter, the man_WWTF. For the Refs Roundtable, this one was for you, big guy. For Wrestling with the Future, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, buy the t-shirt at the link below. I'm Dan the Man. We've said a lot today, and I will see you next time I have something to say.